We are welcome with that. Hello, everyone. We are talking to Dr. Juhem Navarro-Riviera. He's a political scientist with Socio-Analytical Research, and he's working on a new project, the Secular Voices Panel. And take it away, Dr. Juhem. I don't know how we should do that. What is this project that you're talking about?
So sorry, you froze a little bit there, so I couldn't hear the finish of the intro. But so the Secular Voices panel, it's kind of like a continuation of some of the work that I've been doing. This year, I have been able to get back to my secularism research in ways that I haven't been able to do in the last 2 years, mostly because I've been building a business, and that has taken a lot of my scholarship time. But now we're getting into 2020, particularly interesting election time. And so this summer, I've been releasing some of this, but it's the Secular Voices survey. It was actually a survey that I conducted with the help of some people that are subcontracted or that gave me some feedback into the questionnaire. So this Secular Voices survey, it's actually a survey of non-religious people, 520 in total. So we aimed for 500, and we actually got 520, which is great. And it was looking at questions that most surveys don't ask about secular people. One of the problems that I have with most public opinion surveys, when it has to deal with non-religious folk, whether they're atheists, agnostics, nothing in particular, is that the way many of the questions are framed, if you think about the surveys that the Pew Research Center does, for example, or even Gallup, when they ask about policy issues, let's say like abortion, same-sex marriage, it has this religious frame, right? It's kind of like on the back on their heads, you're asking about this aspect of like morality and biblical rules and whatnot. So I wanted to do a survey in which like not only didn't ask questions of that type, so it was more neutral, less religious in terms of the language that it used, but also handle other kinds of issues that not necessarily are part of most surveys in terms of like issue preferences or opinions, but also are more demographically in line with who the knowns are. So there's a lot of questions. So there's questions about separation of church and state and different ways of asking about that. One was about asking it in a issue preference, like if you want the government to work on these particular issues and how much of that with your top 3 priorities. So what we discovered is that that's actually the lowest priority of them all. Healthcare is actually at the top. And there were other tangential issues like like requiring vaccinations or like vaccination exemptions that you don't get mostly asked in many surveys. Issues about education, but not just about like the state of education in the country, but actually like the importance of the cost of education, because one of the things is that the knowns are a very young population. And so they're either, a lot of them are either in college thinking to go to college, or they have recently left college, or in some sort of, it's a highly educated population. So to what extent like these particular material issues of the cost of higher ed, student loan debt actually also affects them, which is quite a lot. And of course, climate change, which a lot of the knowns and a significant part of them are millennials, and I sometimes count myself as one. I'm like in that borderline age in which I could be a Gen X or a millennial. But essentially, these kind of issues, climate change among younger people, are also very important. And so that was the first stage of the project, the Secular Voices survey, that you can find in the Socio-Analitica blog, which you can go to medium.com /Estorias, and it's STORIAS. and you can see some of the stuff that we have released. Some other scholarship I have been doing this year is like I'm writing a couple of book chapters that I have been not being able to finish due to work, and then go into the secular voices panel, which goes into the whole secular voices that I'm trying to do. Now, this is a lot different from the survey that American Atheists just released, which I help a little bit on the side as a volunteer expert doing surveys.
If you were helping with that other
Yeah.
thing that American Atheist was doing, that must have been why I was confused, because I remember there was a point when I thought that these are both the same survey. This is the survey that
No,
UHIM is doing,
no. So,
when in fact
so
you're doing
this
two.
no. Well, I'm not doing two because I'm not working for American Atheists. So I was just externally like provided some feedback, but I'm not part of the team that is working on the project like day-to-day basis. Uh, but essentially, I think those two projects came about independently from each other. Like I've been thinking about this project for a while, and I've been discussing with some of my friends and other scholars in the field. And then like I learned from the people at American Atheists that were also doing this survey, and they were like, somebody suggested my name as one of the of the people who could serve as advisors, which dovetails perfectly. But the American Atheist survey is more comprehensive than this one. This one is like, as a political scientist, are more interested in politics. And this is where I go with the Secular Voices panel. It's different because it's not just a one-off survey. It's essentially the goal is to build a panel of respondents that can take one survey a month in the best of cases, and can do two things. One is like we have this question, like the kind of like the horse race kind of stuff. So asking people who they want to vote for president, and as the Democratic field reduces, that becomes easier. So probably toward the summer, we will have like Trump versus whoever the Democratic nominee is, and whatever sort of third-party candidates end up playing in there. And
That's funny. I'm not even aware of that. Are there third-party candidates that have even?
well, I don't think so far any third-party candidates, but I mean they have different nomination processes, so they usually come later in the game. Especially because some of those third parties may be waiting for what candidates drop out to offer them that position, or some candidates may be thinking about those runs. So that usually comes later in the game. And so that's one part of it, that kind of like that horse race aspect of it. I'm particularly interested because if you look at exit polls, for example, the exit polls don't distinguish between people, the non-religious people, by belief or by identity. So they're knowns, and that's actually the question. That's actually the option in the exit poll is I have no religion. So you don't know if a person is an atheist, agnostic. So when we analyze the known vote, which in recent cycles have been like 2 or 3 to 1 Democrat to Republican in terms of voting, we don't really know if atheists vote differently from agnostics, or like spiritual but not religious vote differently from these groups, because there's no way to disentangle them.
And
So
what the hell
one,
does spiritual but not religious mean? Does your survey cover that?
I mean, there's a self-identification aspect of it, but I mean, people. I mean, that term has a history that I'm not particularly fond of. Like I'm not sure. There's so this tangent into a little bit. There's a lot of discussion about whether these spiritual but not religious people are kind of like the bulk of the knowns, in terms of, like most of these knowns are not really religious, but they do really believe in like God or something. I mean, there's some element of that, but I mean, these people also, like most knowns, don't go to church. They don't practice. So I usually consider that a large segment of those spiritual but not religious people are actually uh, going with your actually strong suit of evolution, like kind of like some that spiritual aspect, some vestigial aspect of religion, which people may not feel comfortable coming out altogether as saying that they don't believe in God. I know that happened to me in like my late teens.
So it's a
So
kind of a the label is kind of a political fence sitting.
I think to some extent it is. I think it varies from person to person, but I think a large segment of it's a lot of people, not necessarily not even political fence sitting, but also people being comfortable to telling others that they don't believe in God. They may internally realize they don't do it, but they don't feel comfortable enough to say so.
I think there's a
To
significant population of people who really don't care about the religious thing at all, but they don't want to say so.
exactly,
Yeah.
and so I think there's a large element of that in there. Um, but we don't even know how those people believe, and even if they're actually a coherent group. So and how they behave. So that some part of the secular voices panel is tracking like that horse race kind of numbers, and whether like people are switching and where people are moving toward as people drop out, and candidates drop out of the race, if their preferred candidates move, or if like the debates happen and then they decide that they don't like that candidate anymore and they like another one better. So that's one element of it, and then the other element of it is asking every month a different topical survey. So like all the questions or most of the questions are going to be on a particular topic. Uh, so let's say in like let's say May, that is a month of graduations and whatnot, could be dedicated to education. And it could be higher education. It could be about the cost of higher education. It could be about the state of education, the education evolution in schools and experiences like in school for people, but from a way in which like secular people are interested in, not in terms of like, do you think like you should be prayer in schools, which is usually what we get in there, like that's kind of like the most common question that we get out there, but actually digging deeper into in terms of like, do people care about it, do people don't care about it, do people are strictly opposed to it, and what policy solutions could they support in that kind of sense. um, and then other questions about institutions, like one that we got really interesting results in the secular voices survey that we did in the summer was looking at, and this comes to not surprise to most people, right? Like most of the knowns vote for Democrats. They're not particularly fond of President Trump. If you have seen the latest surveys that have come out in terms of favorability, so that doesn't come to a surprise that like the Democrats in the House Democrats and the Democratic Party have higher ratings than the Republican Party, Senate Republicans, or President Trump. One interesting aspect is the Supreme Court, which actually people are divided about. So you have a lot of people who don't like Trump, who like the Supreme Court, a lot of people who like Democrats, uh, who don't like the Supreme Court, but essentially like they balance each other out. So it's a very different um, dynamic with how people think about the Supreme Court, secular people think about the Supreme Court. And I think it has to do a lot that even if it has a conservative majority, and now it's an ultra conservative majority now that essentially Anthony Kennedy's out and Brett Kavanaugh is in.
That's got to have an effect. I mean, people think about the Supreme Court maybe with some reverence over past decisions decades ago.
Yes.
That could be it. I mean, maybe people are not realizing how much the Supreme Court has changed in the last couple
No,
of years.
that I find interesting that a lot of people who don't like Republicans consider the Supreme Court a different institution, even though it's essentially now a Republican institution. So that so those are the kind of things that we're looking at. We also want to look at stuff that it's not I don't think I actually seen a survey asking this, but about uh, figures or aspects of the secular, asking about the secular movement as a movement. We have never seen anything like that. Like there, we ask a question about participation in the movement, which I actually published an op-ed for the humanist.com this month, and seeing that people who report participating in the movement, whether it's member in one of the big organizations like the AHA or American Atheists or Freedom from Religion Foundation, or be part of a meetup group or of atheists or a Facebook group of atheists, are more likely to report participating in different political activities than people who are not part of the movement. Um, so that will be also some part of it. There will be also about evaluations of the movement as a political one, right? Like the people think that there is a secular movement. Uh, if they think so, how good it is, or what should its goals be. So essentially, it's kind of like very, to a large extent, it's gonna. So that's why I'm calling it the secular voices panel, because it's essentially going to be secular people asking questions from a secular standpoint, in ways which haven't actually been asked before, and essentially very in that way actually very um, inward looking, rather than trying to compare the nuns to like evangelicals, for example, which is like a very common comparison. We're actually looking within ourselves, as as a demographic, and see like what demographic differences there are. There are
I've
gender
only met
differences. Yeah.
I've only met a couple of Republican atheists, and honestly, just like two, but no, three. I've met three, and I'm confused. I mean, there was a time back in the 1990s when, if you compare the political platforms and so forth, there wasn't a lot of difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The Republican Party was maybe slightly more religious, really. And when I was a kid, when I was born, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were kind of like on opposite sides of the fence from where they are now. It's like they switched position on a lot of policies. And so it's weird how they cross over each other. They were the Democratic Party of like 1962 is the Republican Party now, kind of thing. And so it's interesting how they've swapped places, and then they used to not be so very different, and they're getting the chasm is increasingly vast, where they're becoming more and
I will
more religious.
partially agree with you. I think you're off by 100 years. So not the Democratic Party of 1962, but more like the Democratic Party of 1862. Um, because I mean, by the 1960s, the Democratic Party was championing civil rights,
By
which
the
the
1960s, yeah,
Democratic,
but
but the
that
Republican
was
Party was moving away from.
in 1962. Remember, it was still this was when they started the Southern strategy thing, and then suddenly you had, remember, there was once upon a time the Democratic Party was the racist party. They
Yeah,
were
that's why I'm telling you. Like 1862 is a better year for where the parties
the
stand. Like,
crossover though. The crossover
yeah,
though was in the 1960s.
I would say it's probably more in the 1930s.
Okay. I'd have to show documentation for what I'm referring to, and there may be specific instances you're thinking of that are different than the ones I'm thinking of. But if this were the year that I was born, if I were my dad, then I would
Yeah.
have been a Republican in 1962, where for the same reasons that I'm not a Republican now. Ironically, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Okay. But yeah, like that is true. Like the composition of the parties and like the ideologies of the party have changed drastically in the last 50-ish years. Uh, but what, one interesting aspect of it is that I haven't written this piece and I have been meaning to write it for years. So maybe this is gonna give me like a like additional push. But back in 2010, I started writing or drafting this piece mostly because I was working with the American Religious Identification Survey, and we were comparing the 1990 survey to the 2008, which was what got me started in this whole thing. And the difference between Democrats and Republicans in terms of numbers within the knowns didn't change. So when knowns were 8% of the population, they were more Democratic leaning than Republican, but like it was like 27% were Democrats and 21% were Republicans. Not that much. And then when you look at 2008 survey data, uh, it was like there were no more Republicans, and everyone else who joined the party became a Democrat. And if you look at the age differences, like essentially there were no. If you look at people who weren't born in 1990, so you look at people or weren't of age, so people 18 to 36, um, who were not born or were too young to take the survey, so were not adults. So that chunk essentially had no Republicans, and a bunch of independents and Democrats, but essentially not many Republicans. And I think your dates actually fit into some extent because the 1990 sees the real rise of the Christian right. I was trying to right of the Christian race, race of the Christian right. Um, and to some extent, like there's some theories that says that the Christian right has helped the rise of the knowns. I think there's some element of truth to that, but not what people think. I don't think being a like if you believe in Jesus Christ and you believe like Jesus Christ is the Son of God, just because Pat Robertson of Jerry Falwell don't have the interpretation you like doesn't mean that you need to stop going to the church. You can find a more liberal church, and the thing is, we're seeing a decline of liberal churches. So it's not that the nones are living like they're living religion altogether, which is also why I don't buy a lot of the spiritual but not religious thing, because they're not joining liberal churches, they're not joining liberal religions, they're not just joining.
Would you agree
uh,
that would you agree that people in the Jimmy Carter persuasion were more common back in the 70s when he was president than they are now?
what are we defining as the Jimmy Carter?
Well, he were talking about Democrats versus Republicans and atheists versus evangelicals. Jimmy Carter is a Democrat evangelical. So he does not fit the common mold of an evangelical today by any means. Would you
He's
agree?
also he's also a white Southerner, which are not very common in the Democratic Party these days. So I mean, there's a lot of overlap between these things. And so the question is like the white Southerners left because of religion, or left because of race, or the white male Southerners left because of feminism, religion, and race.
Yeah, and then the Republican Party being founded by a guy who had made statements against religion in general and Christianity in particular. That also is a bit ironic considering the way things have changed over time. You familiar with the things Abraham Lincoln had said against religion?
I've read some stuff, but I'm not a
Yeah.
Lincoln expert.
Yeah, I can't say that he was necessarily an atheist. I'm not sure about that, but Abraham Lincoln was at one point he declared that he didn't believe in Christianity. To be sure, he wasn't part of that.
Mm.
So what do you predict as a political scientist? What are your predictions that we will see fulfilled or overturned over the course of the next year?
I like so I'm gonna tell you a story. I
Okay.
recently moved to a new apartment. I had to get rid of a few books. We're running out of space. DC area, real estate for you. So I kind of started getting rid of a lot of political science books that I thought were useless after 2016. Um, I didn't get rid of my comparative politics books, which are like a lot about democratization, authoritarianism, and a lot of theories that are pretty solid right now. But a lot of books about American political behavior, particularly about legislative theories and how Congress behaves and how the president acts, like those books were like useless, useless, useless. Um, so yeah, what I'm saying is that I'm not sure if I am very good at predicting these days, uh, given my training. But like I think some things are still holding. Like Trump's still pretty unpopular. The question is to what extent the people who don't like him will coalesce or rally around around one candidate enough to beat him, and also is there a critical mass in the states that actually did the election for him, right? Because I mean, you could grow dislike for Trump in California and New York, but like you need it more in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, what are you doing? Because you're in Texas.
Well,
I'm in Maryland. I can't do much more.
I'm going to let you make the final statement. You go ahead and close out how you will. And remember, links below.
Yeah. So yes, the link secularvoicespanel.com, and it's a very important study in terms of it kind of dovetails with what American Atheists and other groups are trying to do. But essentially, we want to understand like how politics and culture and law actually affects the community and how they think about these issues, because like really nothing has been done systematically. We understand where a lot of people come from, religious background, we know a lot about the demographics, but we don't really understand how the movement overall fit with the people who are leaving religion, and how people who are leaving religion or have been non-religious their whole lives actually understand the movement. And so I think that that's the main contribution of these particular project, which is like looking at issues that are not normally asked of people, and also like essentially the community providing feedback to itself.
Very good. All right. As I said, I'm going to put a link there for the Secular Voices panel. This has been Dr. Juhem Navarro-Riviera, political scientist with Socio-Analitica Research. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Aaron.